I asked you this question last week and you found every which way but not to answer it. Just how many grooming gangs have we got in London?
To avoid any misunderstanding, can she define what she means by that?
Yes, if you look at what's gone on in Rotherham, where there are people taking young girls, grooming them for sex, that is what I'm talking about.
We know in London there are issues about exploitation of young people, but they're not as defined by the member in her definition of what those types of gangs are.
So are you saying we haven't got the same sort of gangs that are in Rotherham, Bradford and lots of other places in the country?
Just for you misunderstanding, what does she mean by that?
You know full well what I mean by that. It's all over the television. You know exactly what I mean by that. These gangs of people that are grooming young girls for sex. Do we actually have those in London?
Today, I'm unclear, Chair, what is meant by the question. If she could spell it out, I can answer.
I've just spelt it out. Are you not listening? It's the sort of gangs that groom young girls at a young age for sex. Exactly how much clearer do you want me to be?
In 2012, a landmark case in Rochdale, England sent shockwaves through the British public. 9 men were convicted of exploiting vulnerable girls as young as 13. But this wasn't an isolated incident. It was just the beginning of a scandal that would expose systematic failures across the United Kingdom, including in the heart of the nation's capital. This is the story of how hundreds of children were failed by the very institutions meant to protect them, how warning signs were ignored for decades, and how a perfect storm of bureaucratic failure, cultural paralysis, and institutional cowardice allowed organized predators to operate with near impunity in London streets. We're going to examine one of the most disturbing chapters in modern British criminal history. This video contains discussions of child exploitation and may be disturbing to some viewers. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Before we begin, I want to make something crystal clear. This investigation focuses on criminal networks and institutional failures. The ethnicity or background of perpetrators is mentioned only where it's relevant to understanding how investigations were handled or mishandled. Child sexual exploitation crosses all demographic boundaries, and no community holds a monopoly on either perpetration or victimhood. Now let's begin. To understand how this scandal unfolded, we need to go back to the late 1990s and early 2000s. Picture London, a sprawling metropolis of over 8 million people, divided into 32 boroughs, each with its own local government, social services, and police presence. In boroughs like Tower Hamlets, Newham, Redbridge, and Westminster, social workers were beginning to notice troubling patterns. Vulnerable teenage girls, many in foster care from broken homes or struggling with substance abuse, were going missing for hours or days at a time. When these girls returned, they often showed signs of abuse, physical injuries, intoxication, or severe emotional distress. But when authorities asked what happened, the girls were often unable or unwilling to provide clear answers. And here's where the story gets disturbing. In too many cases, these children weren't treated as victims. They were labeled as troubled, promiscuous, or even willing participants in their own exploitation. Let's talk about who these victims were, because understanding their circumstances is crucial to understanding how they were targeted. Court documents and official inquiries paint a consistent picture. The typical victim was between 11 and 16 years old from a troubled home environment, often with domestic violence, parental substance abuse, or neglect in local authority care, living in children's homes or foster placements experiencing educational problems, truancy, exclusions, or dropping out socially isolated, lacking stable peer relationships or adult support, often struggling with mental health issues, low self-esteem, or previous trauma. These weren't random targets. These were children who had been systematically identified as vulnerable. Children who were desperate for attention, affection, or a sense of belonging. Children who could be manipulated. And that's exactly what happened. The term grooming refers to the process by which predators build trust with potential victims before exploiting them. And in these cases, the methodology was disturbingly consistent. Perpetrators would identify vulnerable girls in public spaces, outside schools, at bus stops, in parks, or at shopping centers. They'd strike up friendly conversations, offer cigarettes or alcohol, provide rides in cars or taxis, give them attention, and make them feel special. Once initial contact was established, the perpetrators would shower victims with gifts, clothes, jewelry, mobile phones, money. They'd take them to restaurants or hotels, make them feel glamorous and adult. Most importantly, they'd offer something these vulnerable children desperately craved: a sense of being cared for. Gradually, perpetrators would separate victims from any support systems they had. They'd encourage truancy, create conflicts with caregivers, and position themselves as the victim's only true friend or boyfriend. Once emotional dependency was established, the abuse would begin. Sometimes it started with a single perpetrator, but in many cases, victims would be passed to other men, friends, relatives, or associates of the original groomer. This is where the gang element comes in. Girls as young as 12 years old were taken to houses, apartments, or hotels where multiple men would be waiting. They were plied with drugs and alcohol, and then they were raped, repeatedly, by multiple perpetrators. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't these girls report what was happening? Why didn't they seek help? The answer reveals how sophisticated and predatory these operations were. First, many victims didn't initially understand they were being exploited. Remember, these were children who'd been systematically groomed to believe these men cared about them. They'd been told they were in relationships, that this was normal, that this was love. Second, when victims did try to report abuse or seek help, they were often disbelieved. Social workers, police officers, and even their own families sometimes dismissed their accounts. They were told they were lying, exaggerating, or had brought it upon themselves. Third, perpetrators used threats and violence to maintain control. Girls were threatened with harm to themselves or their families. Some were blackmailed with intimate photographs or videos. Others were told they'd be blamed or arrested if they went to the police. And here's a particularly disturbing detail that emerged during investigations. Some victims were actually arrested during this period. That's right. While being actively exploited by adult men, some of these child victims were arrested for offenses like public intoxication, drug possession, or disorderly conduct. Instead of being recognized as children in need of protection, they were criminalized. This wasn't just a failure of the criminal justice system. This was an inversion of it. So how did this continue for so long? Why weren't alarm bells ringing across London's police stations and social services departments? That's what we'll examine next. Here's something that should make your blood boil. This scandal wasn't uncovered in 2012 or 2010 or even 2008. People knew. People have been raising alarms for years. The question is, why was nothing done? As early as the late 1990s, internal reports from social workers and youth outreach programs documented concerns about older men targeting vulnerable teenage girls in specific London boroughs. These weren't vague suspicions. These were detailed observations about patterns of behavior. In 2003, a report in one London borough explicitly warned about groups of adult men cultivating relationships with girls in care homes. It identified specific locations where this was occurring: certain takeaway restaurants, taxi ranks, and residential areas. The report made it to local authority safeguarding boards. And then, nothing happened. Why? Several factors contributed to institutional paralysis. Now we need to address the elephant in the room. And this is where this case becomes particularly controversial and politically charged. In many of the documented grooming gang cases across the UK, including London, a significant number of perpetrators were British Pakistani or British Bangladeshi men. This is a factual observation documented in court records and official inquiries. But here's where things get complicated. According to subsequent reviews and testimony from whistleblowers, some early investigations were reportedly hampered by concerns about appearing racist or culturally insensitive. Let me be absolutely clear about what I'm saying here, because this point is often misrepresented or weaponized for political agendas. 1. Child sexual exploitation occurs across all ethnicities, religions, and social classes. No demographic has a monopoly on perpetration. 2. The vast majority of child sexual abuse in the UK is committed by white British men. That's what the statistics show. 3. However, in these specific organized grooming gang cases, there was an overrepresentation of men from British Pakistani backgrounds. This is acknowledged in official reports, including the Alexis J. inquiry. 4. Some professionals who attempted to raise concerns about these specific patterns report facing accusations of racism or being told they were culturally insensitive. This created a chilling effect that may have delayed intervention. This is one of the most contentious aspects of this entire scandal. Some argue that fears of appearing racist directly enabled ongoing abuse by preventing proper investigation. Others argue this narrative is overstated and deflects from broader systemic failures that had nothing to do with cultural sensitivity. What we know for certain is this: vulnerable children needed protection, clear patterns of abuse were documented, and for far too long, adequate action was not taken. Whatever the reasons, whether bureaucratic inertia, resource constraints, cultural concerns, or simple incompetence, the result was the same. Children continued to be harmed. But the problems went far beyond any single factor. What happened in London was a perfect storm of institutional failure at multiple levels. Police didn't adequately share intelligence with social services. Social services didn't coordinate with schools. Schools didn't communicate with healthcare providers. Each agency held pieces of the puzzle, but no one was putting them together. Child protection services were chronically underfunded. Social workers carried impossible caseloads. Police child protection units were understaffed. Specialized training was limited. When you're drowning in cases, patterns become harder to spot. This one is particularly damning. The very characteristics that made these children vulnerable, their troubled backgrounds, substance abuse issues, or previous allegations, were used to dismiss their reports as unreliable. If a girl had lied before, why should authorities believe her now? If she was known to use drugs, maybe she was just confused or attention-seeking. This perverse logic meant the most vulnerable victims were the least likely to be believed. Here's a disturbing detail. Some authorities struggled with how to classify what was happening. Were these child protection issues or criminal justice issues? Were the girls victims or participants? This confusion led to cases falling through cracks between different systems. But not everyone stayed silent. And this is where we need to acknowledge some incredibly brave professionals who tried to raise alarms, often at great personal cost. Several social workers, youth workers, and even some police officers repeatedly flagged concerns through official channels. They filed reports. They escalated cases. They pushed for action. And in some cases, they faced serious consequences for doing so. According to subsequent inquiries and media reports, some of these whistleblowers were accused of racism or cultural insensitivity, subjected to formal complaint sidelined from cases, or reassigned past over for promotions made to feel isolated by colleagues, in some cases, pushed out of their positions entirely. Imagine being a social worker who sees children being harmed, who documents that harm, who repeatedly asks for intervention, and being told you're the problem. One former youth worker, speaking anonymously to media years later, described the frustration. We knew what was happening. We wrote it down. We told our managers. And we were told to be quiet, to be careful about making accusations, to remember we lived in a diverse community. Meanwhile, the girls we were supposed to protect kept disappearing. These whistleblowers deserve recognition. They tried to stop what was happening when it could have made a real difference. They were ignored, silenced, or punished. And the children they tried to save paid the price. So, when did things finally start to change? What finally forced the system to confront what was happening? That's what we'll explore after this brief message. Before we continue, I want to thank today's sponsor, Generic VPN Service. In this digital age, protecting your online privacy is more important than ever. Now, back to the investigation. By 2011, pressure was building. National media attention on grooming gang cases in other UK cities, particularly Rochdale, Rotherham, and Oxford was forcing uncomfortable questions about whether London was experiencing similar problems. The Rochdale case, which resulted in convictions in 2012, was particularly significant. 9 men received sentences ranging from 4 to 19 years for offenses against vulnerable girls. The case received massive media coverage and sparked national debate. This coverage had a galvanizing effect. It gave victims in other areas the courage to come forward. It gave concerned professionals permission to speak more openly about patterns they'd observed. And it created political pressure for action. In London, several things happened almost simultaneously between 2012 and 2015. First, specialized police units began reviewing historical reports of child exploitation with fresh eyes. Second, multi-agency protocols were strengthened, improving information sharing between police, social services, schools, and healthcare providers. Third, training on grooming behaviors and exploitation patterns was rolled out to frontline professionals. Fourth, victim support services were enhanced, with specialized workers trained in trauma-informed approaches. Fifth, several targeted police operations were launched in different London boroughs. Finally, after more than a decade of documented concerns, the system was starting to respond. Once investigations began in earnest, the scale of what had been happening started to emerge, and it was worse than many had feared. Police operations across London boroughs identified multiple networks operating independently, but using strikingly similar methodologies. Intelligence analysts began connecting dots that should have been connected years earlier. The investigative approach had to be fundamentally different from typical criminal investigations. These weren't cases where you had a crime, a victim, and a suspect. These were complex webs of abuse involving multiple perpetrators, multiple victims, and years of ongoing exploitation. Investigators faced several major challenges. Many victims were initially reluctant to cooperate. Years of grooming had left them confused about their experiences. Some still believed they'd been in relationships. Others were terrified of retaliation. Some had developed substance dependencies that made them vulnerable to continued manipulation. Specialized interview techniques had to be developed. Trained officers would conduct multiple interviews over extended periods, building trust gradually. Trauma-informed approaches recognized that victims might not be able to provide consistent, linear narratives of abuse. Much of the abuse had occurred years earlier. Physical evidence was often unavailable. Prosecutions would need to rely heavily on victim testimony, phone records, and patterns of behavior. As prosecutions moved forward, witness intimidation became a serious concern. Some victims reported threats. Others faced pressure from family members or communities not to cooperate with investigations. These weren't simple cases of individual perpetrators. Investigators had to map out networks, who knew whom, who had introduced whom to victims, who had facilitated abuse, who had provided locations. Some networks involved dozens of individuals. Between 2012 and 2024, numerous prosecutions emerged from London-based investigations. While specific case details are often sealed to protect victim identities, we can examine the general patterns. Typical charges included multiple counts of rape, sexual assault, sexual activity with a child trafficking for sexual exploitation causing or inciting child prostitution conspiracy to commit sexual offenses. The prosecutions revealed disturbing details about how these networks operated. Victims would be picked up from specific locations, outside schools, at parks, near children's homes. They'd be taken to apartments, hotels, or houses. Multiple men would be present. Drugs and alcohol would be provided. And then systematic abuse would occur. Some victims testified about being passed between different men over the course of months or years. About being taken to different locations across London, about being told this was normal, that they were special, that they couldn't tell anyone. The courage it took for these young women, now adults, to testify cannot be overstated. They had to relive traumatic experiences in court. They had to face their abusers. They had to endure aggressive cross-examination from defense attorneys. Convictions resulted in significant sentences. Perpetrators received prison terms ranging from several years to decades, depending on the severity and number of offenses. Many received sentences of 15 to 20 years or more. But no sentence could undo the harm that had been done. With conviction secured, attention turned to the broader questions. How had this happened? Who was accountable? And most importantly, how could it be prevented in the future? Multiple inquiries and reviews were launched. Local safeguarding children boards conducted serious case reviews. The Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, IICSA, examined institutional responses. Parliamentary committees held hearings. Independent reviews assessed police and social services practices. The findings were damning. Report after report identified similar failures. Warning signs ignored or dismissed, victims not believed or blamed for their own exploitation, poor information sharing between agencies, inadequate training and resources, cultural and political sensitivities that hampered investigation, systemic biases that viewed certain children as less worthy of protection. But inquiries and reports don't bring back stolen childhoods. They don't erase trauma. They don't undo years of exploitation. For the survivors of this scandal, and that's what they are, survivors, the impacts are lifelong. Many struggle with PTSD, depression, anxiety, and substance abuse issues. Some have difficulty forming healthy relationships. Some face ongoing physical health problems from sexual violence. And here's something that doesn't get discussed enough. Some survivors still feel shame. They still blame themselves. They still wonder if they could have done something different. This is the insidious legacy of grooming. It makes victims doubt their own victimhood. As we near the end of this investigation, we need to address some uncomfortable questions that this scandal raises about British society, institutions, and priorities. Question 1. Why were these children seen as disposable? Let's be honest about something. The victims in these cases were disproportionately children that society had already marginalized. Children in care. Children from troubled families. Children struggling with behavioral issues or substance abuse. These were children that many people had already written off as difficult or troubled, and that made them invisible. When a middle-class child from a stable home goes missing for a night, it's a crisis. When a foster child with a history of running away disappears for 3 days, it's logged as absent without authorization, and life goes on. The harsh reality is that some children's safety mattered less than others. Not officially, not in policy documents, but in practice. Question 2. What does this scandal reveal about institutional priorities? For years, protecting institutional reputations seemed to take precedence over protecting children. Social services worried about being seen as racist. Police worried about community relations. Local authorities worried about negative publicity. Meanwhile, children were being raped. Question 3. Has enough changed? This is perhaps the most important question. Protocols have been updated. Training has been improved. Multi-agency working is better. But are we confident this couldn't happen again? The honest answer is, we can't be sure. Systems are only as good as the people implementing them. Resources remain tight. Vulnerable children still exist. And predators still seek opportunities. Here's something crucial to understand. This isn't just historical. Child sexual exploitation continues to occur in London and across the UK today. The forms may evolve. There's increasing concern about online grooming and exploitation, but the vulnerability of certain children remains constant. According to recent reports, thousands of children are identified as at risk of child sexual exploitation in the UK each year. These are active cases happening right now. The National Crime Agency continues to work on dismantling exploitation networks. Police forces run ongoing operations. Social services intervene in concerning situations daily. But we need to be realistic. There are almost certainly children being exploited today who haven't been identified. There are networks operating that haven't been discovered. There are failures happening that won't be acknowledged until years from now. The question isn't whether the system is perfect. It isn't. The question is whether we've learned enough from past failures to catch problems earlier, to believe children when they report abuse, and to prioritize their safety over institutional comfort. Only time will tell. So what have we learned over the past hour? We've learned that hundreds of vulnerable children in London were systematically exploited by organized networks of predators. That warning signs were documented but ignored for years. That institutional failures at multiple levels enabled ongoing abuse. That cultural sensitivities, resource constraints, and victim-blaming attitudes all contributed to a perfect storm of neglect. We've learned that some professionals tried to raise alarms and were silenced. That victims who sought help were often dismissed or even criminalized. That it took national media attention and public outcry to force meaningful action. And we've learned that even when the system eventually responded, even when investigations were launched and prosecution secured, it couldn't undo the harm that had been done to children who deserve protection but received betrayal instead. This story doesn't have a tidy ending. Some perpetrators have been convicted and imprisoned. Some haven't been caught. Some victims have found ways to heal and move forward with their lives. Others continue to struggle with the trauma of their experiences. What we can say is this: sunlight is the best disinfectant. By documenting these failures, by refusing to look away from uncomfortable truths, by demanding accountability from institutions that failed in their most fundamental duty, we make it harder for similar failures to occur in the future. Not impossible, but harder. If you or someone you know has experienced child sexual exploitation, please know that support is available. Resources are linked in the description below, including helplines and victim support services. If you found this investigation valuable, please consider liking and subscribing. And if you have information about ongoing exploitation, please report it to authorities. Children's safety depends on all of us being willing to see what's in front of us and to speak up when something isn't right. Thank you for watching, and please look after the vulnerable people in your communities.